Could the gas crunch era produce a worthy Pontiac Super Duty? We'll find out. The early 1970s spelled doom for most muscle cars, but one bright exception was the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am with the Super Duty 455 V8. By 1973, the deck was stacked against high-performance cars, with increasing insurance rates, the new net horsepower ratings, reduced compression ratios to help fight emissions, and the coming of unleaded gasoline. However, Pontiac engineers were able to work a couple of loopholes with their new SD version of the 455 Trans Am that ended up being called the fastest Pontiac ever by Car and Driver magazine. Many people believe that 1973 was after the pinnacle of American muscle cars. But looking at this 1973 Pontiac Trans Am with the Super Duty 455, it's obvious that nobody told the Pontiac engineers that the game was over. I think it's important to describe the automotive landscape of 1973. Insurance rates were already high for muscle cars, so automakers were not very enthusiastic about producing them anymore. Purchase prices and the cost of ownership were both high, so these cars were getting hard to sell. Also, the EPA was beginning to crack down on vehicle emissions, and fuel-thirsty, high-powered muscle car engines really didn't fit the program. Add to that the new threat of cheap, downsized offshore imports that were making wildly high fuel economy claims, and you have impractical cars like the Trans Am falling out of favor with the public, and GM brass as well. So how did the highest performance Trans Am to date ever hit the streets in this unfavorable climate? We have the craftiness and the perseverance of Pontiac engineers to thank. The EPA mandated a 50,000-mile emissions testing program for any new engine in 1973. However, the Super Duty 455 was based on the existing 455 V8, so technically it was not a new engine design. This little rule interpretation meant that the Super Duty only had to pass emissions testing after a 4,000-mile break-in period and didn't have to go the full 50,000 miles. This also meant that Pontiac did not have to invest in the expensive lab testing programs for the SD, as the EPA already had the standard 455 testing information on file. Pontiac resisted the urge to just slap the Super Duty name onto an engine that didn't perform. This 1973 version took a little bit of a hit in compression ratio, and the camshaft is a little more conservative for emissions reasons. However, this is still a car that makes enough power to compare with all the previous Trans Ams. But the Super Duty 455 was only visually similar to the standard 455 V8. They looked the same from the outside, but these Super Duties had a different block with 4-bolt main bearings, thicker casting material in the bulkheads and around the cam bearings for a much stiffer structure. And because development money was tight, Pontiac elected to use a crankshaft that was cast rather than forged, but they did do some extra machine processes to the cast crank to improve its strength and durability. The pistons and connecting rods are all forged. A high-pressure oil system was designed to keep the rotating assembly happy, and on top of that strong bottom end sat a pair of some of the most advanced cylinder heads Pontiac had ever designed. They were similar to the Ram Air 4 heads, but Pontiac engineers redesigned the ports to flow even more air, even though the Super Duty 455 was only an 8.5-to-1 compression engine. The intake ports were tall, the exhaust ports were round, and they exited into header-style manifolds designed to be as free-flowing as possible. And if you could see inside the ports of those heads, you'd notice that the push rod actually extends into the intake port, and they ran it through a pressed-in tube, and the bottom of the intake manifold bolts just barely enter into the port area. It's obvious that Pontiac engineers wanted to make these ports as big as possible, even if it meant encroaching on the other systems around the ports. Originally, the Ram Air 4 camshaft was intended for use in this engine, but the emission standards required a cam that had less overall duration. So Pontiac engineers used a Ram Air 3 cam, which was normally installed in manual transmission cars, and they fed the whole thing with a specially jetted Rochester Quadrajet carburetor. The Rochester Quadrajet is attractive because it has a small primary throttle blade and a large secondary, so if you drove around on the primaries, you'd get better fuel economy than a Holley-style carburetor with 4 equally sized throttle blades. These hand-selected parts and specially built engines added up to a 310 horsepower rating at 4,000 RPM, even though these engines were capable of spinning up to about $6 grand. The result of all this engineering was a legitimate mid-13-second quarter-mile car with the EPA seal of approval and a tune-up that delivered surprisingly good fuel economy numbers. Car and Driver ran an automatic Super Duty down the quarter mile and clicked off a 13.751 pass at 103 miles an hour. And although this car has a shaker hood scoop, newly imposed noise regulations mandated that the back of the scoop be closed off and non-functional. Of course, removing the block-off plate was one of the first things that many Super Duty buyers did to allow their high-performance Pontiac engine to breathe even easier and run even faster. Although the 455 SD engine was the star of the show, the rest of the Trans Am package also had plenty to offer. This is far more than a drag race car, and the suspension was refined by Special Projects engineer Herb Adams to deliver excellent braking and cornering in addition to straight-line performance. And of course, being a Pontiac, it had to be comfortable as well. Inside, the high-backed bucket seats, comfortable tilt steering wheel, and a full console make the interior a nice place to be, and the engine-turned dash, loaded with gauges, is one of the best-looking pieces in any muscle car. 1973 was one of the lowest production years for the Firebird Trans Am, so any 73 Trans Am is a pretty rare sight. But they only made 252 Super Duty Trans Ams for 1973, out of a total of about 4,800 Trans Ams. The breakdown was 72 manual transmission cars and 180 automatics. This Buccaneer Red Super Duty in the Brothers Collection is an automatic version, and it looks nearly new today. Looking back, we kind of owe the Pontiac engineers a debt of gratitude for keeping the muscle car alive as long as they did. I mean, sure, by 73, we started to see a little reduction in power, but this car still handled fantastically, it stopped great, and come on, it's got Trans Am styling that's second to none. Just look at the hood bird. If you like cars like this, we have a lot more on our website at MuscleCarOfTheWeek.com, including other earlier Trans Ams and another Super Duty, but from 1974. You should go check it out.